Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today I have the wonderful Michelle Smith. Good morning to you, Michelle.
Morning, Julian. Thank you for inviting me along.
It's great to see you. Great to have you on the show today. And I can tell the audience a little bit about you before we get into a conversation. You are the founder and managing director of Empower Workplace Solutions, where you offer corporate training focused on an empathetic leadership approach to topics like managing loss and bereavement in the workplace, responding to managing sensitive conversations, and supporting and retaining your disabled workforce, amongst other aspects of empathetic leadership. You've got over 20 years experience in palliative care and oncology, and you've held senior positions in large organizations, including Director of Services and lead mobile cancer information specialist. So a wealth of experience to talk about loss in the workplace. And that's what we'll be focusing on today. We're looking at exploring empathetic leadership and focusing on top tips in supporting your team through loss, whether that's death, divorce, financial, whatever it may be in the workplace. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, a conversation I think we need to have. And before we go there, first question I want to ask you, Michelle, is what do you love about what you do?
I think for me, the difference I can make both to organisations, but the workforce within the organisation. And for all of my time in palliative care, I heard from patients earlier on in their journey when they were still well enough to work at the same time, but families throughout and beyond, that they just weren't being supported in the workplace. And it was never coming from a place of not wanting to support. That was the perception. It was because organisations didn't know what to say, how to respond. So it makes it become quite a taboo topic. And it's something that actually it isn't acknowledged in organisations. So my passion for what I do comes from a drive to make a difference and just help people feel satisfied, supported, and want to be able to remain in their place of work.
Now, we've all probably experienced loss of some kind in our lifetime, certainly in the workplace, whether that's death, financial, or even sort of divorce. And I suppose the question I want to ask really is, what made you think there was a real need for organisations to think a bit more about this, in terms of how they go about it, how they support their team, their leaders? Where did that idea come from, and was it from an experience yourself?
I think, like I say, that kind of hearing from people all the way through. And then when I was a director of nursing during the pandemic in a hospice, and I was having to facilitate the video goodbyes. I was taking families around to the back of the building to say goodbye through a window. And when I reflect back on people not getting it right before the pandemic, there's a bit of me that thought there's no way we'll know what to say now because things have become so much more complicated. I've always had that kind of idea in the back of my head, or there could be something here. So I started to research it. Who else was doing anything similar? What was available? How much was it discussed in the workplaces? And as deep as my research was, and as thorough as it was, I've not been able to find anything there. There are grief counsellors, there are employee assistance programs that, of course, all have their place. I don't dismiss that at all. But what we do know is that only a third of managers across the UK feel that they've had either training or are confident in managing these emotional support conversations. So the need is definitely there.
Well, it's a low percentage, isn't it? A third of managers don't feel or feel adequate. So 2/3 of the workforce leaders basically are feeling inadequate, don't have support, don't understand what to do. And it's always a tricky one, isn't it? When somebody in your team has that sort of loss, whatever it may be, how to handle it, how to be sensitive about it, what's the right thing to say, what's the right thing to do, what are the expectations in terms of working. I mean, it's I think it's a really bit of a minefield and in how to go about that. So if you are talking with a leader now or a manager, what are the sort of things do we need to think about if somebody has a loss in their team? What would that be?
I think, that there are several things that we can focus on, and regardless of what that loss is, like you say, it could be financial, it could be you could have lost your home in a house fire, you could have lost your job, you could have had the end of a long-term relationship, you could be pre or post bereaved. So losses are vast, but actually the emotions we experience will be really very similar. So as long as managers can equip themselves with this kind of framework to follow, then actually you should be able to get yourself to a place where you can have these conversations regardless of that loss. So some of the things that I would always encourage people to think about is the focus that they give that team member that they're supporting. So if, for example, so you and I are having a virtual meeting at the moment, but if you were there with emails popping up in the corner and I could see that you were tapping on your keyboard, I'll know that you're not listening to me. I'll know that you're not focused. So the likelihood is that I'm really not going to give you a lot of detail around what's going on. I will want the conversation to be closed as quickly as you're showing me you want it to be closed. Whereas actually the discussion that we're having now, we both checked that all of our other applications were off before we started this conversation. We know that we protected this time for this conversation. And it's simple things like that that really show the person that you want to understand their perspective, you want to listen to them. If it's a face-to-face meeting, make sure that there's a do not disturb on your door, or perhaps, we've got springtime coming now, go for a walk with the person. It doesn't have to be in an office around a desk. Remove those kind of physical barriers and take someone more, somewhere more private. There are simple things that we can do sort of just to create the right environment. Another thing is to, very often when we're in conversation, if it's something emotional, it tends to be that it can be quite anxiety provoking for both sides, both parties. But actually, just by making sure that we remove trying to think about what we're going to say, when can we get our point across, then we actually enable ourselves to stop. Again, it's about that full focus on the person, and we engage with what they're saying. So it removes us from thinking about when can I say what I want to say, when can I get my turn, and instead you wait for you wait for that gap, and that will come when the other person stops talking. So that enables you to make that conversation again fully about the other person. And when we start practicing that a little bit more, you get more comfortable with things like silence, which I always think is actually one of the most powerful communication skills that we can own. And that doesn't matter what you're talking about. I think that can be anything at all. And that can go for a board meeting. If a CEO can use the power of silence just to offer their team 2-3 minutes thinking time, you've thrown an idea out there. And if you expect someone to have an idea there and then, it's likely to be sort of not thought through properly. But just use silence really powerfully. In the boardroom, it can be effective, but actually when you're supporting someone emotionally, it can make the world of difference, because again, you're giving someone maybe time to catch their breath, maybe time just to reflect on a memory they have about the person, or maybe just to be. And actually some people in those emotional support conversations will just need to stop, recharge a little bit so that conversation can go on. And again, that has a benefit to the manager and the team member, because to be able to sustain this emotional conversation, you've both got to have the energy to get through it.
Interesting when you were sharing all that. If we were in the context of talking about loss, you'd be just talking about good empathetic leadership, basically focusing on the individual, have your full attention, make them feel valued, that listening, without the intent of I want to say what I want to say, actually just listening completely regardless, and having those moments of silence is empathetic leadership. It's good listening. It's good way to approach human beings, as it were, isn't it? So I guess that's your approach, isn't it, in terms of this? Is just let's get back to some solid empathetic leadership, isn't it?
It doesn't have to be rocket science. Of course, there will be more complex situations. If you're trying to support somebody who has lost 3 members of their family in the pandemic, and you're a young manager who's only been enrolled 6 months, and you haven't got maybe the experience of having these conversations, I'm not saying it's plain sailing to get through all of these conversations. But like you say, basically it's empathetic leadership. It's trying to understand I think one of the key things as well is understanding empathy versus sympathy. And actually, if we practice empathy above sympathy, again, that person will feel much more valued. I think very few people think about their approach. And one of the first things we automatically say when there's a loss is, I'm sorry to hear that. And you sort of break that down a bit. And whilst it comes from a genuinely good place, it's kind of like an automatic response. But again, the first word there is I am, or the first words. So you're making it about you straight away. Whereas if you were to say, I can't imagine how you feel. Yes, you're starting with I again, but you're putting it back to the person. So if you're saying, I am sorry, that's about how I feel about your situation. Whereas if you're saying, that must be incredibly difficult, you're asking an open question. They can turn around and just say, yes, it is, and they can close it down, or they can choose to go wherever they want. But you're positioning that conversation to go in the direction of your team member. And, the key thing is to let them lead this conversation, never go in with your own agenda. Be prepared in terms of knowing your policy, having a conversation with your HR team, checking with your line manager in advance that if you think there's going to be more flex than normal required, then check that you've ticked that box first. So, yeah, it's, as I say, it's not rocket science, but people still have a fear around the difficulty. And I think a lot of it comes from a fear of just saying the wrong thing and getting it wrong. So instead, we clamp down.
You said sympathy and empathy. I mean, often in situations of loss, people talk a lot of sympathy, don't they? I have sympathy for you. And so do you think the approach should be more empathy as opposed to sympathy?
I definitely do. And the reason behind that, is that sympathy actually does create a hierarchy. And, in the workplace, especially if you're kind of like trying to support someone, you want to try and remove that hierarchy, and you want to talk to that person as a human, not as the person who is in charge of them day in, day out. So you want to really kind of just remove, and you speak to people on a human level. And, if you read things around sympathy, it comes from a place of pity. So you're offering something down rather than coming at it from an equal perspective. And, empathy is about understanding that person's perspective. How can you help them as a manager, showing that you're prepared to walk this journey with them, but you're prepared to walk it alongside them. And that's the really important thing.
So when you get into a conversation with somebody who's just had a loss in your team, what sort of things do they need to think about, apart from obviously consulting perhaps HR from the policy point of view, and we'll come back to that later. What other sort of practical tips would you suggest, just in terms of just getting ourselves ready to think about that conversation?
Well, I think, again, I touched on the environment. That's absolutely key. But also just think about things like, are you the right person to even have this conversation? And sometimes the line manager is kind of like your first choice, but not always the right person. Now, if someone's just going through a disciplinary process and there's some kind of like animosity, that won't be the right person in that moment. If the line manager's just had a bereavement or a loss themselves, again, emotionally, they're not going to be in the right place because, excuse me, because they will also have their own emotions to be dealing with. So check that you're even the right person to deal with it. If it's a particularly complex situation, then, admit that before you even get going with it. It's okay. It's not a sign of weakness if you don't know what to do. And it's really important to be able to share when you're sort of starting to get out of your depth. So one of my tips is definitely to make sure, one, you're the right person to see this through. If you're just about to get your own promotion or leave the organization, don't start this, because it's not a process that's going to be over in a couple of days. It should be prolonged. And, if you're going to start the process and you do it amazingly well, and then someone else is going to come in and that team member has to start their story from the beginning, build the trust, you won't rebuild the same level of trust. Another thing I always think about, and one thing that is definitely becoming more evident in the conversation I'm having, is that loss just isn't featuring on any diversity and equality and EDI strategies. It's just not on the radar at all. And I find that quite surprising, because there are a number of people who experience bullying after a bereavement. We think about it, people have had more complex.
Sorry, just step back a minute there. You just said people get bullied who've had a bereavement. I can't reconcile those two. I've never experienced that. I've not been aware of that. Is that a thing that people get bullied because they've lost somebody? I mean, that sounds horrific. How might that be, and how do we deal with that?
It's definitely happening, and the reason it happens, and especially more so at the moment, is if you think about the more complex nature that bereavement is presenting with us. People haven't been able to say goodbye. They haven't been able to go to funerals. So whatever cultural rituals we might have observed, we've not been able to follow that. If someone has a complex bereavement, we know that for the first 6 months of that bereavement, they will function at 60% of their normal capacity. So whether or not they go straight into the workplace, they're functioning at a lesser level than they're capable of. And if they're out for a prolonged period of time, then other work members are going to have to pick up their workload. So actually that forms resentment and isolation. So that's where the bullying aspect comes in. And like you, I find it really hard to understand that the two things go hand in hand. But it is a problem, and it's something that I feel quite passionately out for, from the EDI perspective, to understand, the discussions I've had, it's just not on people's radar. And the same with discrimination. I spoke with a gentleman only a couple of months ago, and he came from a faith where he is expected as the eldest son to lead the mourning rituals in the lead up to the death and following the death. And one of his parents were taken ill quite suddenly while he was at work one morning. His line manager said he could leave for the hospital, but only once he'd finished his tasks, and he had to tell his team when he went. By the time he'd done all of that, he got to the hospital. It was too late. So the family had to start without him. And actually, he couldn't even lead on the after death rituals, because in an acute environment, things move quickly. So he was then contacted every day for the 2 weeks bereavement leave he had. When was he coming back? What about this deadline? What about that deadline? He actually ended up leaving the organisation. He'd been with them over 2 decades. Now, when you think about the cost to an organisation, someone so very skilled in their profession, to recruit, to train someone to that level again, you're not talking a couple of £100, are you? It's a significant amount of money. And, we have to think it's not just about the impact for that member of staff. 2 other members of his team went because they saw the way he'd been treated. But you kind of have to wonder as well, that manager, it's very unlikely they would have been deliberately difficult. But if I know it was a male manager, if he didn't have the training and the confidence, then actually he might also be impacted by the outcome of this. Yeah. And the next time he has to support a bereaved member of staff, potentially there's more anxiety and he'll be worried about the outcome. So we really got to remember that the 2 sides of this.
So we've got to bring it more into the awareness and sort of to the light, really. I know myself, this is over nearly 25 years ago. I lost my dad, and I had 2 weeks off as you do, but I don't remember too much about whether there was a proactive approach or a conversation about it. I don't know. I can't remember it. I don't think it was. Perhaps it's got better nowadays. I'm sure it has. So when that happens, in terms of being proactive about it, because I think there has to be a bit more proactivity about this sort of process. But even myself trying to think that through, how proactive can you be, and what's the best way to tackle a sensitive situation? Do you wait for them to come to you, or do you go in quickly with the supports? And again, thinking about the support, how do we do that whole workplace? The fact that you said 60% of the productivity is around about 60%, which is significantly down. How do we support that and manage that and help that, and also create? I'm asking you lots of questions here. Create a team that's not so resentful as well. So, what are your thoughts on that? I've asked you about 3 or 4 questions there. Sorry, Michelle.
I think, there's a really easy start point, and it's going back to reviewing your bereavement policy. It is that simple. And then kind of like benchmarking where you're at. Where are you in terms of how many line managers are supported and trained to deliver the support? How many of your staff feel your line managers would deliver that support? And you can do really simple things like, with support, obviously, you can set up an in-house peer support group. Now, this is a really low-cost model of supporting your workforce, because if you have got people within your organization, it doesn't matter what level, who are trained to have these peer-to-peer conversations, then actually people will cope better in the workplace. Discussions are more open, but it's a way of retaining your workforce, but in something that's so low cost. And I think it is, again, with anything, you've got to bring those conversations, you've got to be open, you've got to be transparent. And that's what we're all trying to get to in terms of organizational culture. And loss and grief, bereavement, it all has to be a part of that.
And how does that peer-to-peer support work out in an organization? Give me an example that you've been part of one in an organization you've worked with.
So the reason I'm an advocate of them is, when we are delivering support as a manager, it's really important not to make it about yourself. So it's not about the time that your dad died. If my dad died today and you shared your experience with me, that wouldn't be the right thing to do. It might make you reflect on that time, but actually this is about me. This is about my experience, and they're completely unique. So it's about understanding the boundaries as the manager. But a peer support group kind of shifts that a little bit, and it's like it runs in the same way as a cancer support group. You go there to discuss and get support from people who are going through the same thing. So it kind of removes that kind of the boundary and the hierarchy between sort of support and supported, and you're in an equal playing field where everyone can discuss what's happened to them. They can talk about, well, let's all go for a walk, or at Christmas, doing small things like, you could have, if you're IT savvy in your company, then why not have a virtual board on your intranet where people can leave messages at Christmas? We've got to remember, for some people, they're going to find it really tricky when the Christmas decorations go up and Secret Santa comes out and Christmas party is all the buzz. People are going to really struggle because it's their first Christmas without someone, or they know it's their last Christmas with someone. So there are simple things. Put up a little tree in the office where people can leave messages. Just show that as an organization, you appreciate it's not an easy time for every member of staff. So it's any sort of small way that you kind of just acknowledge it. That's where you'll start making strides.
And I guess that peer-to-peer support is that facilitated by somebody, or is that facilitated by each of themselves? I guess if you get 2 or 3 people who've just been going through a bereavement in your organization, would they just meet together and that be it, or would somebody work to facilitate it? How does it work?
So there should be a trained facilitator, but that can be organizationally. And certainly that's one of the offers that I've got is a workplace champion, and they are trained to deliver that support. And again, they would also be trained to understand that if they were going through a loss themselves, they would not lead that peer support group for as long as it took for them to feel strong enough again. So I think, like you say, it would be quite unproductive and potentially has the risk to just get people sitting and sort of like dwelling on how difficult things are if you haven't got that facilitation model in place. So yeah, really, really important.
And going back to the line manager, what support would they need as well? Because obviously that can be quite tricky. Not that it's all about the line manager, but if they have more support, then they'll be more effective in supporting the individual as well, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I think, from an organization perspective, I honestly think it's 50-50. I think you have to make sure that the line managers are as well looked after as the workforce who are experiencing the grief, because if you've got a team of 20 that you look after, and at least 3 or 4 of those are going through any kind of a loss, the impact that has on our emotional well-being when we're absorbing all of that and not doing anything with it, we might not be able to leave it at the door when we go home at night. We then might want, worry about that person, how they're coping, what they've said. What if that was me? There has to be an outlet. So again, having that kind of that supervision for the line managers, that understanding of how to manage your resilience, look after your own well-being, it's just as important. And like I say, I honestly think it's an equal split. And they're going to have more job satisfaction if they know they can go and deliver these conversations confidently and work towards a good outcome where the staff member feels that they want to remain in that job, they want to stay loyal to that organization. Then that's going to increase their job satisfaction hugely. So they'll practice more, they'll become more confident, they'll become better at these conversations as well. So getting it right on both sides is absolutely vital for success in terms of retention and satisfaction.
Yeah, and I think this is an important topic, and it's like all these, like mental health, bringing that to the forefront, and diversity inclusion. We've got to bring these to the forefront and create awareness. But as you say, you've got to put some structures in place. And I think I like the idea of that peer-to-peer support. It might be more valid in a bigger organization, and having those champions, just like we have mental aid first aiders now. It's creating those people who have become more experts in these areas, that either line managers could go to them and chat to them as well and get some feedback on how to handle this, or they could be the one who facilitates it. I think that's really valuable. Michelle, I really appreciate you being on today. A good topic to talk about, an important topic to talk about, and to give some more awareness and real help today. That's been really useful. If people are interested in connecting with you and getting a bit more understanding how you can help them, what's the best way of them doing that?
So the website, www.empowerworkplacesolutions.co.uk, or my direct email is michelle@empowerworkplacesolutions.co.uk, at either of those channels, and you'll easily reach me.
Well, thank you for your time today, Michelle. Much appreciated.
Lovely. Thank you so much.